Thank you for joining us for this Facebook Live event. I'm Sarasota County Communications Director, Don Patchen. Last week, we discussed a state of emergency resulting from the ongoing red tide event. And today, we'll be taking your questions about the science behind red tide, and you can post those on our comment section on Facebook. Here with me today to help answer these questions are Dr. Tracy Fanara from Mote Marine Laboratory, wanted to say aquarium, but laboratory, and Chuck Henry from the Florida Department of Health in Sarasota. Thank you both for taking the time to be here today. We have a lot of questions coming in from the community, and we want to do our best to answer those and continue those questions and answers beyond the live segment here. So to start off this 20-minute segment or this conversation, Dr. Fanara, I think a lot of people just still don't quite understand what is red tide, what causes it, and actually why does it come to the West Coast or the Gulf Coast?
Right. Wow, that is...
It's a loaded question, yes.
A lot of questions. Okay, so we get 70% of our oxygen from phytoplankton, which are plant-like organisms. They're essential for our survival. But less than 2% of them are harmful, meaning that they contain a toxin. Florida red tide is one of those species. So Florida red tide cells are microscopic little guys, and they have a toxin called brevetoxin. And when that toxin is released, it can cause harm to aquatic life, and we've seen that, unfortunately, for the past month, actually since October. But it can also aerosolize, meaning that it can attach onto sea salt particles, move on shore with winds, causing respiratory irritation for healthy individuals, but for those with asthma or COPD, it can be very serious. That's why it's really important that we monitor where those effects are and alert the public as quickly as possible. What was your next question?
And then I was at a presentation, I think Dr. either Crosley or you explained that it starts way offshore.
Oh yes,
the initiation's not here right at the Gulf Coast.
Yes, and it's really important that people understand that, and it's important because you can't come up with solutions unless you really understand the science and the initiation. So red tide, the only scientific evidence of initiation is offshore, 10 to 40 miles off the shore of Sarasota or the coastline. Gulf Coast, on the ocean bottom, and with currents upwelling, those cells are brought to the surface and brought to the shore by currents and winds. When an existing bloom is close enough to the surface to use surface water nutrients to sustain, it very well can happen. To what extent, we're not sure at this point. Red tide cells, Crania brevis is the species name, it's able to use 12 different forms of nutrients. So it doesn't need that readily available surface water runoff. It can get nutrients from various sources. So it's just really difficult to say how much impact surface water nutrients can have on an existing bloom. But we know that it can certainly, just common sense tells us that it can certainly play a role, as well as currents and water chemistry.
So if it originates 10 to 40 miles away, and so we're at the will of the wind and the tides and the currents where it ends up.
Right, and it's been around since records were written.
Okay.
Travelers in the 1500s were talking about red tide and the dead fish that they were seeing. So prior to urbanization, we know that these red tides would likely be initiating if humans were not in Florida at all.
Okay. So Chuck, I'm going to bounce back, and we're going to start monitoring these questions coming in on Facebook. But we're hearing a lot about canals, the intercoastal canals and waterways within land. Sarasota County, we know, is out there, or utilities and other different folks are out monitoring those on a daily basis. What does it mean for the waterways health, or the health in this as it relates to the waterways?
Well, I certainly can't speak to the waterways health, but in terms of human health concerns.
Right.
With rafts of fish, dead fish floating. Most of the time nature will take its course and take care of those. We do monitor those closely. If we get lots and lots of them piling up and they're not being washed away with the tides or sinking, then we may have some fly issues that we would want to look at, but that would be a case-by-case basis, and we would ask the public to help us keep informed if there are those areas that we should take a look at and monitor for health reasons.
So we do have a question on Facebook already. Forgive me if I say this wrong. Fwaza has put up there, and you touched on it a little bit, Dr. Fanara, about what does pollution and water contamination have an impact? Does it the root cause? Does it affect it? Based
Okay.
on and you kind of touched on it, but I think basically on these questions we want to make sure it's clear.
Right, and it's an extremely important question. So we know that red tide initiates offshore. So those man-made or anthropogenic or natural nutrients can't feed it or start the initiation of a bloom. But if one is close enough to shore to use those nutrients, of course. But the problem that I have with the word contamination or pollution is that it is an umbrella term for so many different chemical contaminants. Nutrients isn't technically a toxin, and a lot of people are referring to it as a toxin. Nutrients are essential for life. We have such a great productive coastline, and that's why we have so many fish. But some people refer to those nutrients as contaminants, but along with toxins from pesticides and herbicides. And obviously we did a lab scale test with herbicides and Corynea, and it actually kills Corynea as expected. It's a plant-like organism. These are toxins to kill plants. Right. So that's why the word contaminant or pollutant has to be specified. Right. When we're talking about
it's such a general term.
Right.
And this is very specific to what can cause or develop.
Right, and a big misconception is the role of phosphorus in a marine environment. The marine environment is nitrogen limited, meaning that you can have all the phosphorus in the world coming in, but it's the nitrogen that's really going to cause that production. It's the opposite in most freshwater bodies, except for Lake Okeechobee, which research says that it goes back and forth. And that's because of the abundant phosphorus that we have in Florida. That body of water kind of beats the odds.
Gotcha. Chuck, let's go over to you for a second. We got a question, I think this was previous to us going on Facebook Live from Annie saying, should we be closing the water or the beaches when there's thousands of fish floating around, decomposing sea life can't be good for humans. But as you were saying earlier, we don't close beaches. We monitor them.
Right. The Department of Health does have a Healthy Beaches program, and we monitor 16 of our public beach sites in Sarasota County, but also track complaints across all 34 miles of our coastline and the hundreds of miles of intercoastal areas. We would post advisories if we believe there's a health threat in the water, and we frequently do that for our bacteriological sampling. And so if the bacterial levels rise above a certain point, and an abundance of caution, we'll post an advisory to let the public know that it's probably not a good time to swim, especially if they're immune compromised, meaning the very young, the very old, or people with chronic disease. It's also important for those with chronic respiratory disease, and Tracy already mentioned that, to be aware of the brevetoxins that they're really released in the wave action as it comes near shore and attaches to those salts and blows with the winds. So when we have inshore winds, easterly flowing winds, it can go inland. Probably up to a mile, maybe a little further, but people with chronic respiratory disease should stay in an air-conditioned space and avoid those toxins. They can cause more severe symptoms than a healthy individual. For the majority of our population, if they do experience symptoms, once they remove themselves from that area, the symptoms go away.
And that is a good segue to this question from Carol. How many people are sick from red tide? Because I know the Department of Health monitors certain aspects about issues such as this.
Right. Well, of course, we couldn't know for sure the numbers, but we do have systems in place to monitor our emergency department visits. We monitor our school health room visits, and we look for what we call syndromes. In this case, we would be monitoring, is there an increase in respiratory symptoms being complained about in either of those venues? And we have seen a slight increase in respiratory complaints across both the emergency departments and our school health rooms, but it's not statistically significant for this time of year with school starting, enough for us to raise a level of concern at this point. And we'll continue to monitor that. That's one of the roles of the health department, to ensure the health and safety of our community.
Great. Going to switch from people to marine life. How does, and you've touched on it, and I think by the questions we want to make sure we're clear, is how does red tide affect all marine life? Because we see a lot of the fish, and then we've seen, unfortunately, some of the mammals and things have washed up.
Right.
Does it affect all marine life the same, or is there different levels to the effect?
That is an excellent question. So with...
I didn't say it, and Amanda posted that, so I want to give a shout out to Amanda.
Okay. Thanks, Amanda. So I'm not a biologist. However, from what I understand, they affect different marine life in different way. For example, fish, they kind of, they block up those sodium channels and cause that respiratory paralysis, kind of like they do with us with our slight respiratory irritation, except fish can't leave. However, like manatee, they eat seagrass, and the toxin can accumulate on epiphytes. They're called the little things that attach to seagrass, and then the manatee eat the seagrass. Okay. So not only is there that that respiratory nervous system issue, but it can also go into the bloodstream and affect other nervous system functionality.
So it affects, it applies in different ways, and
Right.
how it affects different.
Right, and then
sea life.
crabs, there's thought, and I see this on my living docs, that crabs, you see the crabs, and it's thought that it doesn't affect them because it blocks their, they don't have those sodium channels. However, we're finding that the stone crab, that might not be the case. So
Okay.
we're actively doing research to find out the answers to those questions on specific species.
A lot of questions out there, and a lot of answers that, I know both the health department and MOTE are doing to, ensure the public that we're doing everything possible to get the answers to these questions. Chuck, let's jump over to you, kind of tied back, and we got two people posting basically the same question, PJ and Elaine. Explain the difference between the Healthy Beaches program and the difference between bacteria and red tide.
So the Healthy Beaches program looks at common families of bacteria that could contain what we call pathogenic bacteria, or bacteria that can make people sick. And we monitor those families of bacteria, and if the levels go up, we'll post an advisory on the beach for the public that could be hazardous for them to swim. We also work in conjunction with Mote Marine, and we've been doing this since probably 2004. When we're out collecting our Healthy Beaches samples for bacteria, we collect a sample for red tide analysis and bring it to their lab, and they've been analyzing those for our community over the last 15 years to assess year-round the Carenia brevis levels in that, what I call that human touch zone, that people actually interact with the water. So we're constantly monitoring that, and because of that, I know that it's almost always out there. It's just when we have these blooms and the numbers go way up that it becomes a concern for our population. But that's the basic difference. I also think it's important to talk about, because it's a question we get all the time, is it safe to eat the fish? What about the shellfish?
It's up here, so jump right in,
So
Chuck.
I will just say that we certainly recommend that you don't collect shellfish and consume shellfish. They're filter feeders. They would accumulate a number of toxins on themselves. So we would not encourage people to do that. They could end up with a number of toxin-related poisonings from eating those. But I want to be clear that shellfish you could purchase in restaurants doesn't come from our red tide waters. That's a very closely monitored industry from the Department of Agriculture. So that is safe, as well as the finfish. So if you catch finfish, if you're going to fillet them, the flesh of the fish is fine to eat. Of course, the toxins could accumulate in the gills or the guts, so we would encourage people, I don't think, at least I'm not used to eating that part, but that's where the toxins would be. So as long as they're filleted, it's healthy to eat them.
And if they seem like they're swimming okay too.
Right.
You don't want to like go start making meals out of...
Absolutely. Thank you, Tracy.
Don't make meals out of floating fish? Okay.
If the fish is sick, obviously you wouldn't want to eat it. And I shouldn't assume that everybody knows that, but that is very true.
We're located downtown Sarasota. Where I live, I didn't smell anything this morning. Came into work, walked in, and there's definitely a smell in the air. So I think there's, from Carol, she posted a question, how will we know that the air is safe to breathe? But just because it smells doesn't necessarily mean it's not safe to breathe. But is the smell just attributable to dead fish?
So from a health perspective, if the toxins are aerosolized in high enough concentrations, for people that are sensitive to those toxins, it'll cause symptoms like a tightness in the throat or a tickle or even a cough. It can cause watering of the eyes, so typical allergy-like symptoms. If it's just a bad smell, then you're smelling the dead fish and the results of the red tide, but not the toxins. The other thing I would recommend is look at the beach conditions reports that is at Mote Marine's website. You can get a read on what's going on in our beaches and pay particular attention to the wind direction. If the winds are coming on shore, we're more likely to have toxins present in the air than if they're blowing offshore.
So just, and if a parent or a caregiver, somebody or a child or somebody says, hey, I have a scratchy throat, it's just basically, I think you said earlier, is be inside, be in conditioned, filtered air. And
so in fact, we have been working closely with our local school board because they're getting lots of questions.
Right.
And we're recommending that certainly children that have chronic respiratory diseases, most commonly asthma with children, that they have their inhalers with them, and that if they have physical problems, they should see their healthcare provider, of course. But other than that, at this point, we're not recommending any special measures by the schools. We're not mandating or encouraging people to keep the children inside, except for those with known chronic diseases.
Excellent. Got a question also, Tracy, that the term red drift is now out there. Red drift algae, I guess. Is that a new threat, or is that something?
No,
you should explain?
and that should be explained better on the BCRS, and that's something that will happen with the next update. We've always reported
BCRS.
the Beach Conditions Reporting System, just as Joe was talking
Okay.
about. That is our reporting system. The best defense that we have right now is alerting the public of where these effects are so that they can make healthy decisions when going to a beach. So we have 37 trained beach sentinels at Gulf Coast beaches reporting conditions that anyone would want to know if they're going to the beach, like crowds, debris, weather, but also red tide effects like respiratory irritation, dead fish, and water discoloration. So, what was the question? Oh, man. Oh, red drift.
Red drift.
Yes. So red drift has been on there historically because we don't have red tide blooms all the time. However, people see the seaweed coming up, this red drift macroalgae, and that is not harmful at all. It's just the macroalgae, the seaweed that comes ashore. Some people don't like to see it, so they would rather choose a beach that didn't have it. That's why it's listed there. But in the future, we will give a better description on the BCRS of what red drift is. If you click on the question mark, you'll see the definition.
Okay.
But yeah.
And I'm going to use this to even plug the app a little bit more and how people can get it, because we are going down to our final few minutes. But this part of the BCS was like, how can I find out where red tide is or where it's moving to, and does the app, the BCRS, do that for us?
So the BCRS gives us daily conditions of what people are experiencing on the beach. It's more near real-time results. Same thing with CSIC. CSIC is CSIC is our Citizen Science Reporting app for those red tide effects, but also inland effects like odors, wildlife fatalities, or cyanobacteria blooms. But in order to kind of forecast or look at where a bloom is going, the best thing that you can do is look at NOAA has a 5-day respiratory irritation forecast, and it uses our data along with the other data collected from FWC along with currents and winds. It also eventually will be using our HabScope data, and if we have time, I'll talk about that too. It's our citizen science project to get quantitative data for red tide monitoring.
Okay.
But also FWC and USF have a currents map, so you can see where the currents are going to try to see what kind of movement the blooms might have. There are a long list of resources that we can provide people.
Okay. How do people get the app before we move off of the app?
Oh, iTunes or Google Play. For CSIC, it's CSIC, and that's the reporting app. You can also see the reports that other people have made. And then the BCRS is Beach Condition Reporting System.
And that's the one with the little Mote logo. I just want to make it easy for people to find it.
Yes. Okay. So CSIC has the Flask, and BCRS, you might find a reporter app. It's not the reporter app.
Okay.
It's the Beach Condition Reporting System.
Okay, excellent. We're just about out of time. I want to wrap it up, and I can't thank you enough. There's no way we can answer every question out there in the limited time we have, but we wanted to start the dialogue. And Dr. Fanera, just the science behind red tide, and I know Mote is actively monitoring and tracking and providing information as much as possible.
Mitigating too. We're working on different mitigation technologies.
And same with the health department, Chuck, we appreciate you being here and answer some of the questions. There are a lot of concerns about, the aerosols and the respiratory, and you explaining all of that is very helpful to the public.
So, and I would ask the public if they have health questions, they can go to our state health department website at floridahealth.gov and find many of the answers there. We have a local website, ourgulfenvironment.net. On those websites, there's links to Florida Fish and Wildlife, to USF, to the NOAA, and to Moat Marine. So there's many, many partners that are focused with a lot of science eyes, looking at what's happening and trying to put information out for the public.
Thank you. We are out of time, and we're going to continue this dialogue on Facebook. Thank you both, Tracy. Thank you, Chuck, for being here. And thank you for joining us here on Facebook. If we didn't get, as I said, if we didn't get to your questions during this discussion, look for our reply on Facebook. We'll continue to monitor those questions. You can find the latest red tide status by visiting scgov.net red tide. We've also started a red tide update newsletter, and you can go on that webpage. You can register for that. And you can continue to follow Sarasota County on Facebook and Twitter for all the latest information. Thank you for watching.